Welcome. We are going to be going through a series of talks. This is an approach that we're taking to kind of provide a little bit of a review of the faith. We're going to do it in 9 sessions, and we're going to do it in such a way that kind of looks at it from the perspective of really what the faith means to us, right? Really, we oftentimes think about faith in a variety of ways. We'll talk a little bit more about it as we go along. But we are going to look at it primarily from the perspective of what it means to us and how it is that we are to respond, right? So we'll be talking really about what faith is and how it is that we're to respond to it. So this is going to be this segment that we're beginning here is going to be the first segment. And we've kind of called it communion, the ultimate questions, right? The communion, the ultimate questions. Asking ultimate questions is a very important thing, is a critical thing, but we oftentimes don't do it. We don't ask the important questions about life. And why is it that we don't ask those important questions about life? Well, there are a variety of reasons for that, and I'm going to kind of go through a little bit about my personal experience. Everybody's experiences are different, but I'm going to talk a little bit about it from my particular experience. Why it is, I think, that I didn't ask ultimate questions, right? But I think that for the most part, when we don't ask ultimate questions, there's kind of a common root cause. And as I was contemplating it, this passage from the Gospel of Matthew came to me. And the Gospel passage is Jesus talking to his disciples. In fact, he's talking to his disciples at one of the most important events in the New Testament. In some ways, all the events in the New Testament are very important, but one of these are very important. It really is it's referred to as it's where he talks about the Beatitudes, right? He talks about the Beatitudes. This great discourse is critically important. Now, Jesus, when he talks to his disciples, he is using a very tender approach. I can tell you that from my particular experience, that what oftentimes is tender, if you're not in the right frame of mind, tenderness can actually seem like severity, right? So I would suggest that perhaps this is a good way of checking ourselves as we go through. When we think about things, when we hear things that Jesus is proposing to us or the church is proposing to us, and we see it as severity rather than tenderness, I think it's an opportunity to look back at ourselves and try to find out why that is. Well, this passage in this great sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, is one just after he gives us the disciples, right, the Our Father. And he's talking about really the human condition that all of us experience. It is the human condition that we'll talk more and more about as we go along. We're going to be very concentrating a lot on what this human condition really is. But the human condition is something that's very critically important for us. This passage is in chapter 6. It's verse 19. And I would ask you to try to think about it, try to listen to it from the perspective of tenderness, right? From the perspective of Jesus really coming to us, right, as a friend. Coming to us and helping us to try to understand the great danger, right, that our situation here leads us in. This is what he tells us. Jesus says, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." Now, we probably have heard this passage quite a bit, right? Some of us, everybody comes from a different perspective, right? Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. I think that this really is the key to why we don't consider the ultimate questions. Right? The ultimate questions in life. Why, in fact, these ultimate questions can seem unimportant, irrelevant to us. It's oftentimes we find that it takes an experience where the illusion of things of higher importance come about. That we start to consider, we start to contemplate the ultimate questions. And this is something that happened to me. I didn't think about the big questions. Some of the big questions, right? Who am I? Why am I here? Right? What is the purpose in life? What is it really that motivates me? Without asking those questions, one is left to really respond to whatever it is that your eyes, right, your senses get attracted to. And there are a lot of things in this world. And the younger we are, everything is a novelty, right? And we can be so distracted. We're like a little bumblebee, right, flying from little flower to flower, and everything is new. We don't have any focus, right? This is oftentimes why it's much more difficult for us when we're younger to have our treasure in the right place and our heart in the right place. And I was like that, like most of us. I grew up in a Catholic family. I was born into a Catholic family, baptized as an infant. I grew up, I was an altar boy, when we used to call them altar boys, right? We always went to church as a family, right? But to be honest, our faith life, in talks with, my father especially, he would always bring it back to what things were important, right, with respect to God. They weren't shy about that. But as a family also, our attention was oftentimes, like most of us when we were young, on the cares of the world. Right? This is what really motivated us, if you will. This is really what captured most of our attention. And there are a lot of cares of the world. Well, things went along this way, right? I went to church through almost all of my life. There was that one semester in college where it was easy not to, right? The bus, I was living off campus and the buses didn't run on the weekend, so that was a good excuse, right? It didn't keep me from going to parties or things like that, but it was more difficult to get to church. But other than that, I still went to church, other than that semester, continually. But I have to say that my experience of faith, right, never really matured. I didn't really have a sense of what the faith was about. In fact, I couldn't tell you why I went to church. I couldn't tell you what was happening at church. Right? I would go, but it was more out of a sense of obligation than anything else. And so my faith life was essentially dead, I would say. I was living in what I've heard called at one time a spiritual coma. Right? I was completely dead to anything but the cares of the material world. And this was almost up to my 30th birthday, right? My biggest concerns, I went to school after I graduated from high school, became an engineer, and I was very fascinated with engineering. Right? This was one of the things, I was very curious about everything, and engineering seemed to be an approach to answering questions of curiosity. I was in the Air Force, right? In the Air Force, they were in the military in general. They show you your career path, right? And what you need to gradually succeed along a career. And so, engineering, a good career path, which, by the way, in the Air Force, for those that might be interested, those don't go together. But in any case, the other thing was, pretty much, I would say my other focus was perhaps on my golf game, right? golf, being able to get down to shooting par was my ideal. I never got very close to that, right? Well, this was really the life that I was experiencing. This was, in fact, my primary concern. Well, that would come to change, right? My heart was really in things other than where they should have been, and I didn't realize it. I didn't know it, right? At the time, I would have told you that I was a good guy, right? I didn't cheat on my wife. I hadn't killed anybody. I wasn't an axe murderer. I was compared to the worst of things, I was doing pretty well. Right? There should have been a little bit of a hint to me that things weren't quite the way that they should be. I remember one experience, though. This is leading up to this point that I have usually call my Holy 2x4 experience. I remember we were stationed in Japan, and we went to church once. I think it was a Saturday night, actually. A vigil mass. And this priest, he was actually a Jesuit priest who was saying mass. He was from a Catholic university in Tokyo that had come to. He usually came and said masses for the vigil mass for us, and he made the error, I suppose, of allowing this one lady to speak after Mass just before the dismissal. And her speech was basically a fire and brimstone kind of speech. Her point was she got up there and she started to tell us how we were all sinners, right? And if we didn't repent, we were all going straight to hell. And you would think that I would say, from my perspective, she was right about me. She was right about me. But my response to that was, how dare you, right? I was offended by it. Now, why should I be offended at being called a sinner? Well, I think that this is because at some level, we recognize that we're not where we should be. It might not come to our level of consciousness in the way that it should. There are many different reasons for that. And we'll talk about those as we go along. But my response should have been a little bit of a hint. But it wasn't. It wasn't a hint at all. Well, after Japan, we got stationed back in stateside at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. That's really where Trisha's from, my wife. And she is from a very tight-knit family, a very close-knit family, right? And the family always does things together. It's a family that you probably would, if you saw it in a TV show, you would say, oh yeah, that's just Hollywood, right? It's a very close family. In any case, I was working on my master's, my first master's, and this was consuming all of my time. And I had very little time for anything else. I was working, right, full time, and going to school, which was close to full time, and I had very little time. And it was coming towards the end of the semester, and it was really right about at the end of the semester. I was going for a summer semester. But it was also the time of graduation, high school graduation, and the first niece was graduating from high school, the first of Trisha's family's nieces, which was a big event, and everybody was getting together for it. And I was expected to be there, and I didn't want to be there, right? Because I had exams coming up in the next week as well. But Trisha, being as kind of person she was, prevailed upon me. Right, and so I relented, and we went to this graduation. Well, the graduation, party was at her sister's house, right? The mother of the niece who was graduating, and we were all sitting around in the bunch of family was playing horse, right? I don't know if you know what horse is. It's kind of a basketball game where you shoot, right? And you, as you make a basket, you spell out horse, and whoever spells it out first wins, right? And her sister was playing, and her sister all of a sudden comes over to the side, and she goes, I feel a little bit lightheaded. And the next thing we know, she collapses, and she goes into these spasms, and we don't really know what's happening. And all of a sudden, her face starts to change, and she looks, all of a sudden her face is very pale. And we can't, we don't know what's happening. And interestingly enough, as busy as I was, a few weeks before that, I had been teaching CPR. I had to teach CPR, and you had to teach at least once a year at least, to be able to stay, qualified. So I had taught it, and here I am looking at something in an event that I should know what I should do. And I look at this, and I cannot admit that anything is wrong, right? I can't admit that anything is wrong. My sister-in-law here is turning pale. Right? It's obvious that she's no longer breathing. And so I just sit there frozen. And why? I was prepared as much as anybody to do something, and I didn't. I come to realize that that's called moral cowardice. Right? I had no virtue, very little virtue. So her sister, who's a nurse, and her husband respond, and they start to try to do CPR on them, and they're distraught, and they're not doing it right. And so finally, I'm able to muster up the courage, and I start to perform CPR. Well, she responds initially, but then we realize that she's not. And someone says, well, call 911. Right? And I'm thinking, is it that bad? And it is. It is that bad. And all of a sudden you hear the siren go off, right? From having called 911. The siren, it seemed like it was just a block away, but it seems to take forever for it to get there. Well, I was finally relieved from doing this, right, by I think that he was some sort of emergency responder who took over for me. Right? So here we are watching our sister-in-law, my sister-in-law, sister, who is unconscious, is not breathing. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, I wish I wasn't here. And almost in response to my having said that, I hear this voice. It's actually my mother-in-law saying, I'm so glad that we're here. And I'm thinking to myself, why is that? Why is it that she is so glad that she's here? It would have been so much easier not to have been. And I realize, yes, if you love somebody, you want to be there with them, especially in their greatest trials. You want to know what has happened to them. And then my thoughts get moving again, and they get to the fact that I have an exam coming up, and I'm thinking about what this is going to do to me and my schedule and all of a sudden, almost in response to that, I hear Tricia say, "They had children. What about the children?" You see, Margaret had 3 young children. 2 of them were there. And I'm thinking again to myself, what are you thinking? It comes to me, I realize that something is not quite right, and I'm not sure exactly what that is. Right? Well, the ambulance finally comes and takes Margaret to the hospital, and we get a phone call about an hour later, and we hear that Margaret has died. Right? Margaret died at 39 years old with 3 young children. Well, we need to know a little bit about Margaret to understand really how this experience really affected me. And it opened my eyes. It helped me to realize that there was something about life that I didn't understand. There was a way of being, a way of acting in life, and that wasn't where I was. Well, Margaret she grew up in the in the 60s, I suppose, in the 70s. And she was like any child, but she had this disease called scoliosis. It was a severe case of scoliosis. And Tricia's mother was involved in something called the charismatic renewal. And in the charismatic renewal, this is within the Catholic Church, praying, right, over people for healing is a very common aspect, right? Healing is a charism. And so they would pray over Margaret regularly. One time they prayed over her, and she felt something in her body. And it turns out that the next time she went to the doctor, her scoliosis was gone. The doctors couldn't explain it. Right? Scoliosis isn't something you heal, but it was gone. After some, 20 years or so, 18, 20 years? After that, this was Margaret's waking up experience. After Margaret had woken up, she realized, God became real to her. Her treasure changed, and so did her heart. And she was involved in so many different things. She taught special education, and she would bring children into her home, right, to give them the extra time that they needed. She was always out doing things for people. So much so that at her wake, her viewing, the Irish call it a wake, right? At her viewing, the viewing was, I don't remember, 4 or 5 hours long. And all I remember was standing there looking at this line. It was within this church, and the church was it was a gymnasium, right? The tradition since the 19th century and among the Catholic Church in the United States for a variety of reasons is when you build something, you first build the school, and then you build the church because of the importance of Catholic education. And so this parish had been built for quite some time, but the gymnasium was still being used at the church. They still hadn't got the money to build the church. So it was pretty much open. You could see out, right? You could see out the door. And the door you could see along the windows. And all of a sudden it would disappear. And for that whole 4 or 5 hours, you almost never saw the end of the line until the very last moment, right? And as people came in over these 4 or 5 hours, everybody had a story to tell about Margaret, what she did for them, right? And this time I'm listening to these stories and my thoughts start to turn back to myself, but this time not so much selfishness as they were previously, but an examination. And my thoughts were, if that had been me and not Margaret, we would have needed 4 or 5 hours. I mean, we probably would have had about 15 minutes worth of people to come, if that. And there wouldn't have been a lot of stories to tell, right? The stories would have been something more along the lines that oftentimes you hear, well, he loved life. Right? Yes, but not God. That was a problem. And I recognized that there was something wrong here. As I started to think back, I started to realize that throughout, I don't remember even how long, that I had this tapping on my shoulder, right? I remember walking out of Mass, maybe once a month or so. I would get the sense, you really should have some sort of clue about what it is that you're here for, what you're doing here. And I would walk out, and this was in the early 80s, right? I'm sorry, no, this was the 90s, late 80s, this was actually 1990, but in the late 80s, I'd look at the literature rack, and there's really nothing there. At that time, there actually wasn't a lot of literature, believe it or not, available. The internet really wasn't up and going, certainly not with the kind of Catholic presence that we have today. But this started me to thinking, really, what is it that is important in life? Right? What is it that is important in life? What is it that motivates us? What are the ultimate questions? You see, my experience after this was one, in fact, I felt somewhat guilty about it. I was devastated. My whole world had come apart. Basically what had happened is my view of everything had fallen down. I mean, it was collapsed. Nothing seemed important. Right? There was nothing to me that seemed important at all. I was completely confused about what the meaning of life was. The things that a few days earlier had seemed the most important in life now seemed a parody of life. It seemed absolutely dumb. The tasks at work that had to do with national security, right? And all of a sudden I see, what's the sense? Right? And I start to really fear. I couldn't believe how fragile life actually was. It started me to thinking, what is it? Right? What is it that I'm missing? Well, as I start to think about it, I start to realize that what is missing is my sense of the priority of relationships. What is it about relationships? Right? Because it was this loss of this relationship. I mean, Margaret and I had that kind of an affinity for Margaret because we both shared the same birthday. She was always smiling, always laughing, right? She was always the most joyous person around. But, and we had been, but we got married, right, very quickly. And we were in Japan for most of the time of our marriage. And then we were only back for, a year? A couple of years, right, after we left Japan. So my time with her, though, was, personally was not that great. Maybe a total less than 3 years where we spent, a bit of time together. And so my response, as I said, I felt guilty about it because it seemed so out of proportion. Certainly it seemed out of proportion with regard to the way I saw everybody else, right? I saw, for example, the family that would get together afterward, they got together shortly afterwards, and they were able to laugh about, they would talk about Margaret and laugh about their experiences with her among the tears. And that laughter made no sense to me. Right? I didn't really understand the fundamental role of relationships and what it means to be a human person. Right? Relationships are really the first thing. I came to realize that relationships, and we know this very much, right? The most important things in life we take for granted when we have them. We take for granted eating and breathing unless we can't or have difficulty with them, right? We also take for granted our relationships until we have difficulty with them. We know in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, those that know who Maslow is, right? Maslow has in his hierarchy, relationships are not as fundamental, right? For Maslow, who was an atheist, biological needs were much more fundamental. But for how many of us, when we have relationship difficulties, when we lose somebody very close, how unimportant is breathing and eating? We don't care about it anymore, right? So I had an experience that was, again, out of proportion. It was almost a sort of depression. In this, I started to much more come to understand the fundamentals. And I started to recognize more and more what it was that had caused this mistaken notion in me. Why things were upside down. Why my treasure, if you will. My heart was in the wrong place. I came to recognize that ultimately, there's only one thing that ultimately satisfies us. There's only one thing that ultimately causes us the peace that we're looking for, that gives us really the joy that we're looking for, and that's love.